And welcome to everyone, wherever you may be located in the world. Can we start with you, Susan Koff? What are your stories which have brought you to where you are today?
Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to both Michelle and Katharina for this wonderful opportunity and for the invitation to participate in this event. For the last 2 years, as much as maybe we disliked Zoom and not being able to get on a plane and visit each other in person, this has afforded a great opportunity to, expand events. And as you both said to me as we were starting, there are people participating from many different countries, many different continents. So this is very exciting to be able to reach out to a lot of different people. So thank you. Stories. Wow. Well, if I told you how old I was, then there are many stories, but I think a couple of significant ones are that my very first dance experiences as a 6 or 7 year old were in a studio that was all about creative movement. And I think that was hugely significant in my life because instead of being exposed firstly to formalized techniques and focusing on something external, such as the line of the body or something like that, I was really exposed to expression and being able to have a different kind of voice for myself. And I think that has stayed with me forever. So that's been very significant. Regardless of that, I did get involved in very formalized techniques and pursued a very traditional path of a BFA, a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. But somewhere in the context of that, I did discover that I really loved teaching. And so I pursued an MA degree rather than an MFA degree. And in teaching, I first was very focused on teaching those aspiring professionals. I loved technique and the forms and everything like that. But in doing that, I was also discovered that I was afraid of children because I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any formalized experience what to do, even though I had that own, experience of my own. And at one point, just to, make a few extra dollars, as we all do earlier in our career, dollars for me, maybe pounds for you, I discovered that I had to teach children because that's where the money was. And instead of being afraid of them, I found all the joy that I had had in creative movement expression. And it just reminded me that I really needed to return to that. And so with all that, I started to focus myself on what is dance education and what kind of development do I need to really focus on children. That really forced me into the definition that actually led to this book. It's called, I wrote an article 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, 22 years ago, called Toward a Definition of Dance Education. And people still read it today. It's amazing. It's just, I get, on one of those online forums of how many people have looked it up. And there are thousands and thousands of reads of this one article. And so thinking about that, then I was actually approached from Methuen, who's part of Bloomsbury in London, and asked if I wanted to go further with it. And that's how this book was born. So the title of the book is Dance Education, a Redefinition. It is clearly about dealing with our language and how do we focus our world.
And I think in the questions that I'll be asking you, Susan, throughout this lecture, we will touch on, I'm sure, that language that we use. But I want to really start to delve into some of the content of that book. So the characteristics of what defines any art form can be as long as they are broad and often very, very contentious. So in your book, Dance Education, a Redefinition, you ask the questions, what is dance? and what defines dance as an art form. So can you talk a little bit to us about the significance of these two questions?
Well, along with the need for a redefinition of dance education, I find that we get very involved in labels. And with labels, something either is or it is not. And that becomes problematic. So I spend a lot of time, as you noted, on those questions, but without coming up with a definitive answer. And I think what's really critical for me as I have grown in the profession is that instead of labeling things, we talk about what are the characteristics of what we're experiencing right at that particular time. So I think it's really critical that when we talk about an art form, for example, if I say I'm creating art, then I'm creating art. If somebody from the outside doesn't see art, that's okay too. But I do present in the book that dance is done for many purposes. Some of the actual focus point of a dance creation can be as an art with strong intention, but some of the focus, some of the reasons for the creation of the dance or for the performance or for the participation in a dance may have nothing to do with art. But somebody may experience expression, and then we can define that expression as being involved in an art form. The other piece that I think is really important, and I'll use Katherine Dunham as an example. Katherine Dunham, as we well know, was a very important dancer, choreographer, performer, dance educator of the 20th century. And she actually began her academic career or her investigation as an anthropologist, as an anthropology major. And through the context of that, she traveled to Haiti as an anthropologist, not as a dancer. But through that was exposed to the voodoo events, because they are religious events, they're not performances. And recognized that there was dance and movement in it, but the focus, if you would have talked to any of the people who were in the events with her, were not thinking now we're creating art. But she took what she experienced and she took it very much from an inside perspective. That's another really critical point that I want to make. You take any art form or any movement form or any form of expression, and you have to have knowledge of it from the inside. So she actually became a participant, was invited and given entree into participation, but took elements of that and when back in the United States, created elements of that, put it on the concert stage and called it art. And she had the license to do that. She was not appropriating. That's another really critical piece. She knew the intent and the knowledge, and one of her focus points in creating it for the concert stage was that she honored the original intent and did not make blasphemy out of it. And so the definition of an art form is very complicated. If I walk down the street and suddenly just jump for joy, I could say I'm creating art, or I could say I'm just creating joy, but it's my perspective that counts. And if I invite somebody to observe it or move that jump for joy now to a concert stage and say, I would love an audience to come see the art I've created, I've labeled it as an art form. And that's the kind of definition and sort of labeling that I want to both be wary of, but as well, invite people to play with those names.
I think my heart sinks a little when I read work, and not always student work, but anything that says, and this means, and I go, well, it might mean that to you, but it doesn't mean that necessarily to me, and it may not mean that in a few weeks' time what I thought it was meaning. So I think it is quite interesting to really delve in how we are using our language when we're describing things. And really, my next question is about drawing on the thinking that defining dance as an art form, which you beautifully articulated, can be a little messy, maybe a lot messy. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in what your views are on some dance genres appearing to be privileged over others.
Do you have 20 more hours so we can have this discussion? It's just, this is an element that has become so central to my work, and both central in my commentary on many things, and also part of an evolution. So I want to step back just a little bit and say, we're not fixed in time. Things that I might have answered you when I was first a Bachelor of Fine Arts student many years ago are not the same answers I would give you today. And I hope not the same answers I'll give you in 10 years' time. So we always have to evolve. What I've discovered, first, it was a point of individual discovery as well as just global awareness and being aware of differences and similarities, is that we have privileged dance forms that come predominantly from Western contexts. And that has really been elevated and promulgated through colonialism. And now, we get into sticky global politics, but it's quite clear that, ballet has traveled the world over, not with the intention, the ballet form itself, to suppress people, but other people who we will disassociate from have taken ballet and really used it to say this is superior, and the ways you've been moving in your entire lifetime are not as superior. So what we've done is we've created like this hierarchy, and it's really unfortunate because as I sit here today and talk to two people and perhaps some of your students from RAD, we all love ballet. We don't need to denigrate ballet to take it out of a hierarchical form. We just have to look at it honestly and be allowed to look at it in light and not in comparison to any other dance form that exists in the world. And in doing that, we can be honest about it. In the 1970s, so many years ago, it seems, I will mispronounce her last name, so I just won't say it. Joanne Kay, and it's a Hawaiian last name, wrote a groundbreaking piece calling ballet as an ethnic art form. And in doing that, she created more of a horizontal arrangement rather than a hierarchical arrangement, in that there are qualities of ballet that express a very specific ethnic frame in this world, just as there are qualities of any dance form that express where the form arose. And that's what I'm after in this conversation. What becomes a little problematic is some people are still taking a value of any dance form and saying this is better than something else. And especially, here I am sitting in New York, you're in London. We are talking about Western focused countries that have Western performances on a concert stage, most often a proscenium concert stage. And that sort of labels this is art. And that also creates the hierarchy. If we can remove all those definitions, and again, it's about definitions, and just talk about this as a place where dance happens, and dance also happens in other places, and they're equally valuable. You just have to get inside it and find out what's happening there. Then we can look at things in a much more horizontal arrangement and recognize that there's value in any form of dance. We just have to be able to see it from the intent and the purpose with which it's made.
Thank you, Susan. I can hopefully share, well, I will share with our participants, our attendees, that you're just recovering from a cold and you're holding out, your voice is holding out.
Good.
And I'm just saying this because my next question is a little bit long, so it might longer than the other, so it might give you an opportunity to take a sip of water. So the title of your book, Dance Education, a Redefinition, infers that how dance education was defined and thought about in the past is perhaps not how we should be thinking about dance education, whatever that is, in the present. So how do you think the legacies of dance education from the past have informed or reshaped how dance education is being conceptualized in the present?
A lot of times I'll meet people or I'll hear people or, define themselves and they say, I am a dance educator. And to me, what sometimes they're talking about is they are training people to dance. Now, training people to dance, to actually know the insides of a technical form, is a really wonderful profession, but it's not the same. And that's where this book begins. So that's what the article in the year 2000, it was 2000, so 22 years ago, was about. There has to be a way of differentiating between those things. And to me, dance education is a much more encompassing definition. And it really goes to go very fast sort of ahead, and then I'll go back and deconstruct some of those pieces. Dance happens in so many places. As I said before, dance happens in religious ceremonies. It happens in the home. It happens when you walk down the street and you hear some nice music. It happens in a formal setting, such as a concert stage. And it also happens in schools where people are trained specifically in a technique. And within many countries around the world, and I know also in England, there's actual dance in the formal schooling system. And so what becomes a problem here is sometimes, especially always, it seems, people are fraught with, we have so many things that we need young people to learn. They have to learn to read, they have to learn to write, they have to learn basic mathematics, they have to learn how the world works, what is science, they have to learn all these things. So when it comes to, they also have classes in dance and maybe classes in music and other art forms, people will come along and say, well, there's not enough time in the school day, and why is this important? Or we just have to eliminate this because we're not getting our kids ready for all those things that they have to be ready for. And so that becomes problematic, and that becomes part of the definition. If we really have what I define as dance education in the schools, then parents, administrators, taxpayers, politicians, and everybody in that whole list who make the formal decisions about what happens there will then realize that this is just as essential as they need to learn to read and write. The problem is many times where it's confused with what I'll call dance training, these people who don't know dance, who are administrators or the funders, policymakers, taxpayers, or what have you, walk into the school and see people in a formal dance lesson of a technique, think, well, that's not getting them anywhere when they need to read and write and complete their qualifications for a diploma. So that's really the beginning of that definition. How do we explain this to all those people who are not inside the dance? And I probably spend the entire book leading up to that. So several hundred pages later, I come to the definition that dance is about being able to be a complete human being. So I go through a whole pathway of how do I get there. But we have to be in order to be a complete human being, there is, again, going back to formal schooling, very strong emphasis on what I'm doing right now, expressing ourselves orally, and translate that both into written expression and other symbol systems of expression, most notably mathematics. However, we have not developed our full range of expression if we are not also allowed to learn our full range of expression. And I assert that that happens through dance education, because we need to not only know how to communicate, but we also have to know who we are. And the only way to know who we are is to explore through our own cultural past experiences, family life, home life, community, and things that we know. And so much of that happens through very informal dance. I don't know a culture in this world that doesn't have some kind of movement form involved with it. And those are the very movement forms that may have been, put lower on the hierarchy. So with doing that, I think we have to know who we are as people, as our backgrounds and experiences allow us to know it. And we have to be able to tie into our own communities and be able to express our joy with each other non-verbally. And many times that comes through movement and food and some other things, but all those things tie together. So another part of this definition that becomes so complicated is that when we look at dance expression that comes from our own backgrounds and experiences, so many times it's not delineated into little silos, like now we're eating, now we're dancing, now we're talking, now we're celebrating, now we're praying or something like that. But so many times it's all tied together and there is no definition. There is no boundary between what's happening, and it becomes just very seamless expression. So to go back to my definition and where this book goes, sometimes we have to go to cultures other than Western situated cultures to really explore that even in some cultures, there's no actual word for dance, but dance is part of something larger, more connected with other events in people's lives. And that by pulling it out and calling it dance, we've put things in that, again, hierarchical relationship rather than opening it up. So I go through, as I said in the book, I go through many chapters of teasing out those elements. One of the most critical elements for me to encounter that really helped to focus this definition, and I should backtrack to say, again, I don't like individual definitions. So it's an evolving sort of multifaceted, always in process definition, is that through my work in DAISY, Dance and the Child International, we work with a lot of UNESCO documents and definitions and statements about how to be in the world that really opens up our own ways of looking at things. Years ago, UNESCO defined 3 forms of education. And they defined formal education, which I think when I say that word, we all click into and we immediately know what it is. Non-formal education and informal education. The part that's most missed in our daily practices is what's called informal education. And that's what I'm referring to in these events, these things in our lives where things are just kind of happening for no special reason. And I'll give you an example. When everything was shut down in New York, as it was most places of the world, gyms were closed, also studios, any place to do any kind of movement experience. And so, of course, I took to walking, just walking around, which is lovely in New York City. And I was walking every day through a really nice sort of quiet park near me. And there was an impromptu group that became friends through this. Different demographic for me, different age group, different backgrounds and experiences, but they gathered there almost every day. And one guy sort of was the glue that held the group together, was always had music playing. And it got to the point where I would walk past them on a pretty regular basis. So we started with a little hello, and things progressed along. And pretty soon, you know, the music just inspired me. And one guy got up and we just started sort of doing this impromptu dance down the pathway of the park. And then it became kind of a thing, you know, where they would expect me. And, you know, if the guy with the great music wasn't there, I was really disappointed. I was losing my spark. But, you know, this was a totally informal experience. This is where dancing happens kind of between the borders, between the lines of definition. And this is truly valuable in our own growth and experience, because those experiences are what leave imprints on us in who we are and how we know others. I don't know anything else about this group of people. I don't know where they live. I don't know their names. I don't know anything about them. But in a certain way, we know something about each other. And that's what I'm getting at in my definition of dance education.
I think I'm glad you touched there on those concepts of formal, non-formal, and informal dance education. And when I'm asked, well, you know, why should I have dance on the curriculum? Why can't I use it? I go, well, you know what? Everybody has a body. They're all different types of body, but everyone has a body, and everyone moves in their own ways. You don't have to pick up an instrument. You don't have to be, you know, having a sort of discussion with somebody else. You can just dance for just the joy of moving, however you might move, whatever limitations you have on moving. It's really quite, for me, a real sort of starting point. We all have bodies and we all can move our bodies in different ways. But why, Susan, do you think it's important, if at all it is important, that we as dance educators, or indeed dance teachers, trainers, really understand that distinction between formal, non-formal, and informal aspects of dance?
I think it's really critical. The definition for me between formal and non-formal, which built on the UNESCO definition. Let me just backtrack to say the UNESCO definitions are not for any particular discipline. It's just their statement in the world. So they talk about it regardless of what you're studying and learning. And they do give a very strong focus for valuing informal education and not denigrating it when in formal contexts. So the definition between formal and non-formal for me is many times just being a part of a larger curriculum. So if it's just a dance class, but a formalized in the sense that there is a teacher, there's a time and appointed place to show up and do that, and it may even be a sequence of classes, that to me is non-formal. Formal is where it's part of a much larger curriculum and many times actually, you know, given a grade or a diploma or some kind of credential. So those are definitions that we can immediately jump to in our mind and say, oh, I'm a tertiary student in an institution. I'm getting a degree in dance. I am in formal dance education. The difference, the part that's really missing is the informal. And I go through, I actually have a chapter each on formal, non-formal, and informal. And the informal is much harder to define because it doesn't have a set place and a time. It oftentimes doesn't have a teacher. What really counts, and what I think is wonderful, is that fluidity. But we're informing so much of our own knowing about ourselves and other people through what's happening there. A perfect example of that is you go, there's a program that of course has been suspended through the pandemic, like so many things, at Lincoln Center in New York City called Midsummer Night Swing. And each night there is a different kind of swing band and a delineated space around it. And they actually do what I'll call a non-formal lesson ahead of time, people who are experts in that particular type of swing or type of dance, because it's a broad definition. It actually includes salsa and some other dance forms that are not swing dance. But what happens there is people pay for that lesson, but then they're open to just dance with the music. And you can stay all night, and you cannot pay for it at all and stand just outside the perimeter, which I've done many times, and enjoy the music. And you can enjoy this music on any level you want. You can pass by, listen to one tune. You can just do a little movement as you pass by and be done. Or you can start moving around on your own. And then the fluidity that I'm talking about, the teacher or no teacher, can even be somebody sees you kind of there fluidly, and they may grab you and start to move with you. And all before the pandemic, when you could reach out and grab a total stranger. And in that, maybe one person is sort of leading. And so when they're leading, they may be the teacher. And then you start to lead a little bit, and then you're teaching them something that you know. And it becomes this very even exchanging kind of process without words. I'm using my right foot here. I'm stepping a quarter of a foot to the side. And then, all of this really formalized education. The other piece about this that is so important is that in my past, and I've asked a colleague of mine who you know to write a chapter in the book about a research process that we both were involved with, along with two other colleagues. And that is, it was an interview process. And through those interviews, we found out that some people who were involved in formal dance education in a degree program sometimes entered that program, and all this prior knowledge that they learned either through a Midsummer Night Swing event or in their homes or at a family party or at somebody's wedding, they were actually told that that didn't count. And that to me is just appalling. So they were told, well, it didn't teach you how to extend the line of your leg, so that's not valuable in this setting. And so one of my sort of high horses or focus points in my own education is when I work with teachers is to make sure that they know that they should include people's prior knowledge. And not only include it, but celebrate it and make it part of the teaching and learning experience, so that the teacher is not, again, the know-it-all single source of knowledge in a class, but that it's this combination of all the prior knowledge of the students in any given setting and how it all comes together. So that's what's so significant about it for me. I was a little shocked to know that there have been people in our own profession, professors in higher education, who've had the audacity to say to people, but it didn't teach you how to point your foot properly, so it doesn't count. And I think that those days need to be in our past, and we need to move forward.
I think you remind me there, Susan, of when I was called in by an artistic director who said, "You know what your problem is, Michelle?" And I went, "Oh, here we go. Your problem is you think too much. I don't want you to think, I just want you to do." And I went, okay, because my dance training, my vocation was, I must have had wonderful teachers who encouraged us, even at a young age, to think about what we were doing, ask questions. Why do we do this? And she would ask questions like, how do you know you're doing this? What are you feeling when you're doing this? So this notion that once you became a professional dancer, this artistic director didn't want you to think, just wanted you to be the body, just follow the instruction, was a real sort of, in a way, a bit of a shock, but I got over it. But I think it just reinforced my sort of principle of, I want people to think, feel, express, and to be valued. Everything that they do in some way has value, which sort of leads me on to my last question. Dance, either as an art form or an education, is often presented as a means through which we can see and experience things, whatever those things are, differently. So how do you, Susan Koff, see the potential of dance as either performance or study to authentically tap into or raise awareness of this concept of multiculturalism?
Well, I've touched on it a little bit today, and that is that, we have to look beyond who we are ourselves. And we have to include not only in who we are ourselves, but to also include with others who we encounter, to give them space to include who they are. The name multiculturalism has been fraught with some really negative events in the past. This is also about, I would say close to 20 years ago, I was actually a consultant for a small school district in New Jersey, which is a neighboring state to New York, so it's fairly close. And it was a very small school district. It was sort of a smaller town, intact, with one high school or one secondary school, one middle school, and multiple primary or elementary schools feeding into it. So it was a very sort of like closed system. It was very easy to meet with a lot of people who were all connected there. And they hired me as a consultant to work at that time. All the people who were involved in dance within the school, and they were actively teaching dance within all these schools, were all physical education licensed people. And they were sort of stuck, if you will, like, how do we do this? And when I first met with them, their enthusiasm was really high, but the superficial nature of what they were doing was a little appalling. And so, I think in any good education system, rather than go in and just tell them what to do, I'm the expert, I've come here to tell you what to do, I would go visit their classrooms and talk with them about what excited them and what did they do and what would they like to do with kids, and what experiences did they have in dance in the past. And one of the first days, came to me in the most excited way and said, well, we really try to teach cultures through dance. And now on Cinco de Mayo, we're all going to learn the Mexican hat dance. And my face just went, oh. And I thought, okay, I can't express my perfect disappointment here because I don't want to create a vacuum. But I think that was the perfect example of the bad side of multiculturalism. By just grabbing something out of the hat, anybody who's either been in Mexico or is from Mexico knows that Cinco de Mayo is not a very important holiday. I like to think of it as a holiday that's been created by bars in the United States as a drinking holiday, an excuse for a drinking holiday, and instead really dive into the Mexican culture and find values of the Mexican culture and try to incorporate those. And the most important detail that could actually happen is to see if there's anybody in the local community or the school who actually is from Mexico, rather than going on this very superficial level. So multiculturalism is a problematic issue. I quote one scholar, again, not from the arts, who coined the term that I really liked called boutique multiculturalism, because he said it's like plucking all these little things and saying, we're going to have our week of dancing around the world, and somebody's going to show us a hand gesture from India and a foot gesture from this country and something like that. And before you know it, we've traveled around the world and we've done multiple cultures. But that to me is his perfect definition of boutique multiculturalism. Multiculturalism really instead has to be about getting inside. And so I'll return to my definition of what I started with about Katherine Dunham. She spent the time, because she had the lens of an anthropologist, and didn't just travel to Haiti and get on a bus tour and see all the sights, but she got inside the culture. And even though that wasn't her culture of origin, she found people who would really be her guides to go inside. And the only way to really do multiculturalism is to find those guides and to respect the culture and what values the culture has. So it's not just this is the step, this is the dance step, but what values are these representing? And I think that's the way in which we can really honor multiculturalism.
Professor Susan Koff, it's been an absolute delight speaking with you, hearing what you've said. You've certainly given myself a lot to go back and reflect upon and think about. So on behalf of everyone here listening to you, thank you very much.